Hello and welcome. My name is Julia Chen. I'm the Activities Director at the Yale Club, and I'm so excited to see so many of you joining us today for our virtual lecture series, where we bring in a live speaker to do a talk and a Q&A that you can participate in from the comfort of your homes. Today, we are excited to welcome Professor Jeffrey C. Alexander. Professor Alexander is the Lillian Chavenson Saden Professor of Sociology at Yale University. After over 4 decades of research and teaching, he has pioneered the field of cultural sociology, which emphasizes the social significance of collective meanings and uses tools from the humanities like narrative, performance, symbol, and icon to analyze them. Professor Alexander founded and co-directs Yale Center for Cultural Sociology and co-edits the American Journal of Cultural Sociology, both associated with the Yale School that Alexander and his students and colleagues have created. Among Professor Alexander's recent publications are What Makes a Social Crisis? The Societalization of Social Problems, The Drama of Social Life, and Trauma, a Social Theory. Today, he is joining us to speak on the exciting and timely topic of the double whammy trauma, narrative and counter-narrative during the COVID George Floyd. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to you, Professor. Professor, I believe you're muted. One moment.
There we go.
There you go.
Thank you, Julia. And I'm happy to speak to my fellow Yaleys today or this early evening. On a serious topic, I'd like to begin with this quotation from a recent New York Times investigation. Brendan Hermanson, 51, a construction worker for 3 decades, has come through the pandemic healthy and employed. At home in Milwaukee, where he lives with his grown son, he tries to tune out the hostile politics in the country and wonders if he should bother to vote again for President Trump in November or, quote, sit back and watch it crumble. The American experiment is teetering. It's all screwed, said Mr. Hermanson, who is white. It seems to me we're pretty close to a fall. In interviews with more than 24 voters in key political battleground states, Republicans, Democrats, and independents of diverse ages, races, and social classes, they all expressed worries that their nation has careened off track, with problems no election could easily solve. Fiercely polarized over public health, public safety, and perhaps truth itself, many people are united in their collective anxiety. 40 years ago, in her book, A Distant Mirror, Barbara Tuchman's haunting account of how the Black Death dropped the curtain on the Middle Ages. The author insisted that, quote, an event of great agony is bearable only in the belief that it will bring about a better world. And if it does not, she argued, then, quote, disillusion is deep and moves on to self-doubt and self-disgust. That warning, issued more than 4 decades ago, vividly describes the situation we're in today. The overwhelming concern of most Americans, I think, is whether a better America will emerge from the trauma of COVID and racial violence that Anthony Fauci recently characterized as the double whammy. If Americans do not believe that their agony has produced a better world, I think that not only disillusion, but social upheaval will follow. Now, trauma can be physical, attacking the body. It can also be psychological, undermining the emotional security of the self. Each level of trauma has been at the center of American attention, these 2 levels, since the COVID crisis exploded in early March. Most visible has been the biological. In the 14th century, nobody had any idea what caused the Black Death, or how to treat it, much less how to prevent it from ever happening again. Today, thanks to biological science, we know that pandemic is a virus, that it takes over the cellular RNA manufacturing millions of new viral cells that attack the respiratory system while keeping the body's immune processes at bay. Because science understands the biology of our trauma, we also know how to protect ourselves from it. Social distance, masks, hand washing. We do not yet know how to cure the illness, nor how to prevent this physical trauma from happening again. But the combination of scientific medicine and big pharma capitalism makes us pretty confident, for Anthony Fauci to a near certainty, that eventually we will know these things and be able to resolve COVID trauma at the level of the body. Emotional trauma has also exploded during the time of COVID. The human psyche translates fear of biological injury and the separation from others that prevents it into high anxiety. Ontological security is undermined by precarity. The paranoid imagination runs rampant. Waves of fear and trembling wash over our psyches. Reports about emotional experience have permeated factional and fictional media throughout this crisis. Here's another quote from that same story in the Times a few days ago. A third of Americans were showing signs of clinical anxiety or depression at the end of April, according to an emergency weekly survey of American households carried out by the Census Bureau. In early May, half of those surveyed said they felt, quote, down, depressed, or hopeless, double the number who responded that way in a 2014 survey. This is the scariest thing I've ever seen in my life, said Eric Widener, 28, the manager of a restaurant in Doylestown, Pennsylvania, on his way to work last week for the first day of the state's opening for food service. There's a new genre of COVID nightmares. Prescriptions for psychotropic medications are way up. So is alcohol consumption. We know a great deal about emotional responses to this coronavirus, even if this knowledge is less precise than our biological understanding. What people suffer from is an anxiety disorder related to traumatic stress, something like a real-time version of PTSD. There are therapies to treat this condition, chemical and interpersonal, but nothing can prevent it from occurring. Fear of biological danger and death and maintaining social isolation to prevent it trigger emotional trauma. Feeling physically vital and emotionally connected to others is essential to our psychological security. There is, however, another level of trauma that COVID has triggered. While there's a lot of talk around it, it's rarely been explicitly thematized either by experts or by people in the weeds of everyday COVID life. Yes, trauma is biological and emotional, but it can also be social, challenging the collective identity that anchors a group's cultural security. The stories we have been telling ourselves about ourselves are turned upside down. Sometimes our very collective existence seems called into question. Cultural trauma is a wound to us, however this us is defined. To take a commonplace example, in New Haven, where I live, it's been a great shock to the community that a restaurant named Clark's has permanently shut down. The gritty, down at the heels landmark on Whitney Avenue had been a mainstay of Yale social life for 75 years. To give another example of more serious import, during the 3 months of crisis and shutdown, many New Yorkers experienced the traumatic disappearance of their city. Can this be New York? People exclaimed at the sight of empty streets, darkened theaters, lifeless shops. But it's the national level of collective identity that concerns me here. The cultural trauma that is afflicting America, not as a collection of individual bodies or psyches, but as a social group. COVID has challenged the story Americans have long told themselves about the greatness of our nation. It unfolded against an already gnawing fear of decline that has haunted our collective consciousness since the late 1960s, challenged militarily by Vietnam, economically by Japan, and now China, and politically by presidential corruption and racial strife. In the liminal space of collective trauma, social actors compete not only over resources and statistics, but over the narrative control that allows cultural identity and domination. When President Trump campaigned for the presidency, he promised to famously make America great again. As his re-election loomed, he prepared to campaign on the story that he had succeeded. Faced with COVID, Trump made every effort to maintain this triumphal narrative, engaging in repeated performances of denial. When objective developments undermined the verisimilitude, the reality of this narrative strategy, Trump shifted rhetorical gears, casting himself as the heroic protagonist in a story about victory over polluting enemies: the virus, the Democrats, the governors, the Chinese. Now, reality cannot disprove cultural constructions, but it can make them seem less plausible. Rising infection and death rates dampened the applause required to provide Trump's presidential performance with the seamless appearance of dramatic success. Other heroes, first scientists, then governors, emerged who seemed for many Americans to speak a more powerful truth. A story about a weakened nation and a derelict president who had failed to keep COVID at bay and then to fight it forcefully after it emerged. This counter-narrative, intimating an America in decline, gathered force as the national response to COVID was debilitated by fragmentation and humbled by social inequality. It became a tidal wave after Minneapolis police murdered George Floyd on Memorial Day, the holiday honoring Americans who had made the ultimate sacrifice for the nation. The current anti-racism protests are a counter-performance, challenging the president's triumphal narrative of national purity and strength with a story about failure, national weakness, and dangerous national decline. During the first exclusively COVID phase of collective trauma, President Trump was a principal character on the American stage. Against his claims of heroism, the counter-narrative cast him as a bumbler, dissembler, and fool. The cresting wave of protest against police brutality, which created this traumatic double whammy, has cast the president as evil, as a racist autocrat threatening the country's very democratic identity. The people, quote unquote, have emerged now as a major character in the trauma drama's liminal space on the public stage. A powerful civil protagonist now confronting Trump who is here portrayed as an anti-democratic antagonist. The growing dramatic power of this counter-narrative and the sacred purity attributed to the character called the people threatens to push the president off the historical stage. Cultural trauma is a contingent, open-ended social process. How it is crystallized in the collective consciousness and what its outcome will be materially and institutionally cannot be determined in advance. And even after it becomes crystallized, it may continue to change. What exactly happened? Who were the victims? Who the perpetrators? What can we do to ensure that the trauma will never happen again? From a naturalistic common sense perspective, the answers to such questions seem obvious. But from a cultural sociological perspective, they are not. Rather, they are subject to enormous disputation, to narrative and counter-narrative, performance and counter-performance. Answering these questions assigns social responsibility and points to possibilities for institutional change. When the death camps were first reported, the mass murder of the Jewish people was attributed to Hitler and the Nazis, and the Holocaust trauma was circumscribed by the theater of the Second World War. In the years after, however, as the trauma of the Holocaust began to permeate Western consciousness, the category of perpetrators expanded beyond Hitler and Nazis to Christian civilization as a whole. And the category of victims expanded to include Jewish victims of anti-Semitism anywhere for all time. Preventing this trauma from ever happening again now meant something very different from creating post-war European peace. It meant dismantling anti-Semitism and incorporating Jewish people for the first time in human history fully into Western social life. A cultural struggle over what has happened during the COVID crisis, who are the victims and who the perpetrators, is being fought out right now before our very eyes. President Trump and his chorus are chanting a bitter story about division, retrofitting the polarizing rhetoric, politics, and policies that brought the right-wing populist to power and has defined his first term. In the narrative, they are spinning region is turned against region, red against blue, white against black, party against party, and police and army against citizens. The president has cast himself as the avenging angel of white people who imagine themselves suffering the trauma of race replacement. Playing to type as a furious, enraged, and enraging demagogue, the president has defined COVID as an ideological confrontation, proposing to resolve our trauma by getting Americans back to business and allowing denizens of red states to roam free. The Trump production team is narrating the second wave of trauma in much the same way. They portray white people as the victims, Blacks, liberals, and urban protesters as perpetrators, and law and order as a solution that will make this traumatic experience go away. The anti-Trump counter-narrative, by contrast, casts the president as amoral and selfish, an authoritarian ruler whose brutish power is contested by educated truth tellers and grassroots heroes, scientists, healthcare workers, food service employees. Opposing the rhetoric of division and diminution, this counterplot tells a story about expanding social empathy, about everyday heroes, and widening civil solidarity. The victims of COVID trauma are all of us, regardless of region or race. We are all in this together, experiencing the same fear and trembling. The pandemic affects rich and poor alike, according to this narrative. Young people shelter in place to protect older people. People wear masks not only to protect themselves, but everyone around them. People shut down the economy willingly, not because the government has forced them to, and not only out of concern for their own health, but for the health of co-workers, customers, employees, indeed for the health of the whole nation. In a column headlined, "The People Are Leading the Leaders," the New York Times' David Brooks challenged what he called the impression that America is deeply divided. In other words, he's challenging the narrative of the divided nation with a counter-narrative of wholeness. He writes, "America is less divided than it was before the pandemic. The big story now is that regular Republicans are not following the Trumpian Taliban in their shrill cries to reopen everything immediately. Americans in red and blue states are staying home at nearly exactly the same rates. There's little correlation between whether a state is red or blue and how it is fighting the disease." 2 months earlier, during the trauma's first weeks, Brooks' fellow columnist Roger Cohen also emphasized wholeness over division. "It's coming apart. Take care of it. We won't give up. We are connected to one another and to generations past and future. There are no strangers here." In this anti-Trump reading of national trauma, the antagonist is not merely the COVID virus, but populist leaders like the president and his supporters who seek to narrow empathy, to constrict the circle of the we, to undermine the newly enhanced civil solidarity blossoming before our very eyes. "Donald Trump is our national catastrophe," the Times editorial page headlined on June 6th, above a biting indictment written by conservative Bret Stephens. But the category of perpetrators, those responsible for our trauma, is expanded beyond these anti-civil leaders. It also includes the nation's healthcare system, which has left untreated and uncared for so many who throughout the crisis have so valiantly served. And the category of victims has enlarged to include more than the people who have been infected. It has come to include the economically disadvantaged and racial minorities. As COVID has highlighted the deleterious health consequences of inequality, changes not only in healthcare provision, but in the nation's stratification system are being demanded. People shouldn't lose their health if they lose their jobs. Essential workers putting their lives on the line suffer higher rates of infection and death. Where's the fairness? Where's the solidarity? Inside the framework of this counter-narrative, a drama of injustice is playing out before our very eyes. Catharsis can be achieved only if institutions are reformed to reflect these heightened feelings of expanded solidarity. For a while now, New Yorker art critic Peter Sheldall wrote in mid-April, we have been reminded of our oneness throughout the world and across time with all the living and the dead. The gruesome police murder of George Floyd occurred inside this wrenching national drama of plot and counterplot, division and solidarity, disparity and justice. Creating a national convulsion, a play within a play, it intensified the collective trauma that COVID had created, directing the spotlight of the counter-narrative to illuminate 400 years of racial suffering and oppression. Can America be a great nation if its solidarity is defined by the color of a person's skin rather than the content of their character, in the words of Martin Luther King? Is it God bless America or God damned America, as Barack Obama's Chicago preacher, Pastor Jeremy Wright, dangerously asked? Is our trauma about anarchy or is it about injustice? Are the victims Americans of color or property owners? Is it police or protesters? Who are the perpetrators of this second trauma wave? Is it whining liberals and treasonous protesters? Or institutional racism, the whites who put it into place, and the politicians and government officials who continue to defend it? Has the MAGA movement been disreputably disrupted? Or is America a racist nation with the chickens finally coming home to roost? The second trauma wave has heightened the sense of what's at stake. Four-star military leaders like James Mattis and Michael Mullen attacked the president for using the army to suppress protest, accusing Trump of violating the constitutional right for peaceable assembly at the core of America's democratic identity. National leaders issue jeremiads that portray our democracy as teetering on the edge. Describing this moment as the singular crisis of our time, they dramatize the deepness of the national wound. The president and his team of counter-performers write plots, cast characters, and create what they hope are evocative mise-en-scène. Trump clears Lafayette Park so he can pose grim-faced before an Episcopal church with Bible in hand. Al Sharpton delivers a fiery sermon at one of several funerals, depicting the courage and gallantry of George Floyd. But it is the audience of American citizens closely watching these contending performances who have the final say, who decide which performance is authentic, which narrative seems real, and which not. During the first days of racial protest, it seemed that Trump might succeed in leveraging the unrest to position himself as the heroic champion of law and order, riding the new wave of white resentment into the White House for a second term. By the second week in June, news media were reporting quite a different reaction. A large majority of Americans turned out to support the protests, identifying with the protagonist of the counter-narrative and the morale of its plot. Here's what the New York Times reported last Friday, June 12th. Mr. Trump has portrayed protesters as terrorists and extremists while praising most law enforcement officers as great people. Yet, in a Monmouth University poll released last week, 57% of Americans, including a majority of white people, said the anger that led to the protests was completely justified. Even among self-described conservatives, 65% said the protesters' frustrations were at least somewhat justified. And the data is even more striking among younger people. In a new Washington Post Shar school survey, 41% of Republicans over 55 said they believed the killing of Mr. Floyd reflected a broader problem. And that figure grew to 52% among Republicans under 55. There's a similar generational gap among independent voters as well. Now let me conclude. Collective traumas, I've argued, are sociological, not biological. Made, not born. They are determined neither by natural law nor material force, but rather by continuous cultural conflict and construction. Yet, while the meaning making between now and November cannot be foretold, we do know what it will be about. As our national drama continues to play itself out, it will crystallize the meaning of the double whammy trauma of COVID and George Floyd. Until the votes are actually counted on Tuesday, November 3rd, we will remain inside the fog of culture war, responding to competing constructions of narrative, performance, and character, to arguments about whether America is still great, never was great, or can be made great again, and by whom. The people against Trump is a powerful narrative. Will an actor emerge who can successfully perform the people as the electoral campaign proceeds? If the Democrats are to win, Joe Biden will have to step out of his basement, stop missing his marks, and stop mumbling his lines. Biden will have to become an heroic character who convincingly declares that it's possible to transform our world. Only if the erstwhile Democratic Party candidate can become dramatically compelling can American institutions be so repaired that this double whammy trauma will never happen again. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor. We'll now actually move into some Q&A, but while you all think of your questions, Professor, I would love it if you could tell us a little bit about actually cultural sociology, this field that you pioneered and what's unique about it, and as I'm sure there are, the ways that it affects us in our everyday lives.
That's a nice softball question. I'm happy to take a swing at that. I think most of you know sociology as something that studies the external realities of life, especially economic inequality, political bureaucracy, racial dominations, and material conflicts. But I think that sociology needs to also address subjectivity. To the collective, needs to find ways of talking about the collective subjectivity. And this talk is an example of an effort to do that. I think that we live in, not just in a legal world and a physical world, but we live in a symbolic world that is just as real for us as other more objective kinds of forces. Maybe one way of thinking about this is that is to think about a very deep binary that people who do social theory and who do sociology and social science have made, which is this split between a traditional world and a modern world. The traditional world, people say, is one of magic, fantasy, rituals, icons, and irrational beliefs. whereas the modern world is depicted as something rational, defined by science, and very individualistic and transparent. The famous sociologist Max Weber called modernity a rational legal society. Cultural sociology challenges this split between the traditional and modern and says that, in fact, modern society is filled with all of the things that people thought were circumscribed to traditional life. We have rituals, we have performances, we have stories instead of science. We can't prove some of the most important convictions that we have. We still have religion. And modern life has been really deeply affected, sometimes for the better and sometimes for the worst, by irrational and non-rational forces, whether they're charismatic demagogues like Hitler or inspiring leaders like Abraham Lincoln or Winston Churchill. So what I've tried to do in my career is to develop the theories, the concepts to understand these non and irrational social forces, and to bring these into sociology. And what I've, probably the main way I've done that is by trying to bring tools and ideas in from the humanities to argue that the ways that we might feel about a novel when we're reading it are not that much different from the way we feel about being a member of society in our own lives. That the tools we might use to analyze a novel, like the narrative, the story, the counter-narrative, that they are also part of our life. The notion of symbols from the humanities, the notion of icons. The very notion of trauma, of course, is something developed in psychoanalytic theories, which now are very important and have been in the humanities. How's that?
That is great. And we actually have a question, we have a comment saying that as an English professor, Sylvia completely agrees with you about our literature.
Thank you, Sylvia. I'm happy to have your support.
And then a little bit of a longer question, so I'll rephrase a little bit, but basically the question is asking that you spoke about how after an event of great agony, it's only bearable if it brings a better world, and if not, there will be this social upheaval. Are there any examples that you have seen, that you've studied of something like this happening?
I think history has a lot of examples like that. I mean, the one that always comes to, well, there's two examples that come to mind, and I think Barbara Tuchman had them both in mind also. I mean, think about the First World War and Germany. The First World War was a devastating and really shocking event in Europe, not so much in the United States. It was shocking, but not devastating in Europe. Western Europe, Europe as a whole, had thought that we're living in a progressive time, an age of equilibrium. There were no borders between states, et cetera, et cetera. You have this shattering trauma of this almost 5-year-long war. Then the question is, what could redeem this war? What would be made out of this trauma? Some nations moved towards more inclusiveness, as they did after the Second World War, when, for example, Britain developed a welfare state. But in Germany, arguments about that First World War trauma were contentious in the same way that we're having arguments now about COVID and police murder. So, for example, Germany was very reluctant. Many Germans were reluctant to say that German generals or the German people themselves could have been responsible for the loss that Germany suffered, which led, of course, to enormous suffering in terms of inflation and poverty after the conclusion of the war. The idea of German greatness ruled. It was thought that Germany couldn't be in decline. Who was to blame then for World War I and that trauma? International bankers, the Jews, Americans, English. How could Germany then, this is the narrative that Hitler rode to power, by creating a way of getting out of this trauma, creating great social conflict, great unrest. Because also Weimar, the experiment in democracy, was not able to create a good society. They couldn't control inflation. They couldn't create solidarity. So then instead you had this right-wing anti-democratic alternative, Nazism, that promised that it would relieve the German people of the trauma through a narrative of division, destruction. And of course that failed. That's the kind of thing I have in mind here, the analogy. And I think that's what Barbara Tuchman had in mind too, that this is a real nightmare for many Americans, and it's a challenge to the national narrative of a good society, of America being a good society, maybe even a great one. Then the question is, what will come out of this? And if something good doesn't come out of this, of course, what's good is contested. I think there will be a great deal of social unrest and anger.
Got it. So I have a question that's more of a comment, but maybe you could just speak on it. The commenting that I feel like the world's view of America had already degraded before this situation, and it has only gotten worse now.
The world's view of America, well, that's a different story from Americans' view of themselves. So this talk, I'm trying to keep it, it's very important when you do cultural sociology to see who the agent is and what the terrain is, and to try to interpret the subjectivity of the actors within the field you're looking at. But it's perfectly true that the image of the United States, I mean, America, we had this brief period between, let's say, the end of the war and Vietnam, where we thought of ourselves as a very popular nation. But if you look at France, the French always were permeated by anti-intellectualism. I mean, not anti-intellectualism, by anti-Americanism. But Vietnam crystallized a narrative that had been widespread before World War II. And I think that the image of America outside the United States goes up and down, but the current president and the sad state of the United States in terms of world comparisons with the coronavirus and now racial unrest, yes, it's deeply undermining what has already been a precarious identity overseas.
So we have a question from Sylvia asking, so what kind of good can come of these traumas? How will we determine that it is good? And how will we define it since we continue to be so divided?
Well, I mean, first of all, the we would have to be qualified. Which we are we talking about? So one scenario would be that the idea of a more just America, if the trauma is one is caused and interpreted as one of division, debilitation, vulnerability, the decline of the healthcare system, stratification, inequality, etc., then what gets us out of this trauma is expanded solidarity, much greater incorporation, much less racism, and a much more effective social reconstruction of the healthcare system. This is what FDR did vis-a-vis the trauma of the Great Depression. He created a story, a narrative, and a sense among, let's say, 60 or 70% of Americans that by reconstructing the United States in a more holistic and inclusive way, we would emerge. And the World War II kind of confirmed that sense. So that's one scenario for answering the trauma. But of course, another one is that, and what I wanted to say in this talk is that this narrative and counter-narrative, performance and counter-performance is what this election is about. It's not just voting. It's not just who will become president, but each standard bearer, if you will, is a protagonist in a narrative and a drama. Our presidential elections are giant, giant dramatic performances, both in person and online and in commercials and in the media. But they carry very significant moral messages. If Trump can gain dramatic power and make Biden look like a bumbling fool or worse, then a large part of then he'll reconstruct the United States as he's been continuing to do it, to privatize health services, to undermine the biological defense of the United States, and to increase inequality. And then that election would be what Barbara Tuchman suggested earlier, that for at least half the United States, it would be thought that no good has come out of this crisis. And there'd be a bitterness and a disillusionment, and probably a lot of radicalization, violence, protest, and cynicism and alienation.
So we have a two-part question from Tom. Could the current anti-racism movement, which seems to be attracting a majority of support, be the foundation of something good that can come from the trauma of COVID-19? And also, are you speaking with anyone in the Biden campaign to advise them on developing their narrative?
No, they haven't given me a call. Maybe somebody's listening to this. I guess what I wanted to say is that the question isn't only whether something will come out of the anti-racism protest, but I think we need to realize something already has come. That public rhetoric crystallizing the subjective map of the United States, this is very important. It's important now, it's important for the future, and it's vital in terms of influencing the distribution of material resources. So it's clear that the drama, which has erupted into a second drama after the murder of George Floyd, is, in my view, it's healthy, it's productive, and it opens up immense possibilities for creating a country that has a lot less racism. it's what Hegel called the cunning of history. It's a tragedy that George Floyd was murdered, but it's almost like the killing of Jesus Christ. A death can become an opportunity for a revelation about inclusion, incorporation, and transcendence.
We had a question from Barbara about cultural identity, asking, do you think that Americans really feel themselves as global citizens rather than what the political arena is marketing about Americans?
Well, of course, I mean, there's a few layers of that really interesting question. I mean, there are a small percentage of Americans, let's say 5%, but that's maybe 15 or 20 million, maybe 30 million who are very cosmopolitan and who feel themselves to be global citizens. These are maybe businessmen who travel all over the world or are in touch with things, people who know languages, et cetera, et cetera. But let's face it, most Americans are pretty homebound. It doesn't make them nativists, though. I mean, I'd want to make the distinction. At this point in human history, the nation is more or less the effective boundary of feelings of solidarity. That's not just true in the United States. It's true all over the world. So there's this constant tension between universalism and solidarity that stops at the national border and something bigger, some kind of cosmopolitan or global solidarity. Even in Europe, which managed to, for the first time in modern times, in the last 500 years, create an extra national solidarity in the form of the EU. Even there, those feelings of solidarity certainly stopped at Fortress Europe and have been very particularistic vis-a-vis others, vis-a-vis immigrants, for example, and other countries. But in addition, it's coming under a lot of strain in terms of nation states in Europe today.
Great. Well, I don't think we have any other questions, but did you have any closing remarks for us?
Well, no final lessons, but I think that one interesting thing is that we are all part of this national conversation. We are most of us are part of it as an audience because we're looking at characters, whether it's the constructed character of the people or individual leaders speaking, or what we get from media and social media. But at the same time, as one of my students, Ann Taylor, has written about, leaders become followers. So we are part of this conversation. We talk about it to our friends. We talk about it to our office mates. We enter online and make comments. So I think it's fascinating how much we are involved in the social drama ourselves.
And thank you so much, Professor, for taking the time to speak with us today. And thank you everyone for attending. We have lots more exciting events coming up, so be sure to keep your eye on that calendar, and we hope to see you at one of them again soon. Until then, stay safe, stay connected, and we'll see you next time.